welcome to a series of interviews I started during COVID. We called it I Was Thinking, or I Was Just Thinking with Rudy Maxa. We really haven't done any lately because sort of COVID ended and we all went back to real life and more traveling and more work. But I still have this yearning to talk to somebody, to talk to people at greater length than some other outlets allow me to do, like my weekend radio show, in which interviews are like 6 minutes long. I'm delighted to be joined today by Pico Iyer. You probably know his name. He is an author. He was born in Oxford, England, but as a young boy, his parents moved to California. His parents are Indian. They moved to California, but I guess they figured American higher education wasn't for him, and they sent him back to England for Eton and for Oxford, and then he came back to America to Harvard. So he's clearly overqualified. Since 1987, he's lived with his Japanese wife in Western Japan. I gather in a rather rural place, not in a big city. Is that right, Pico?
It is right. It's also sort of a boring suburb.
It's a what?
A boring suburb. But yeah, far from any big city.
A boring suburb. Okay. He's done at least 3 TED Talks. He's spoken from everyone. I love this. I got this from his book that we're going to talk about. He's spoken everywhere from West Point to Davos, from Shanghai to Bogota. That's quite a wide range. And I wanted to talk to him about a book I just read of his called The Half-Known Life, subtitled In Search of Paradise. And as a travel journalist, I seem to interview a lot of people who are looking for paradise, whether they're couples who give up their day-to-day jobs and decide to roam around the world, at least in America in an RV, or roam around the world later in life. Folks who are trying to find the perfect island in Indonesia to retire. This is not that book. This is not the kind of paradise we're looking for, although Indonesia does come into play. This is a book, a thoughtful book by Pico, in which he brings he's trying to find peace in a world of tumult. Is that a fair 8-word description, Pico?
It's a perfect 8-word description. And you could also say trying to find hope in a world of division.
Yes. And it's and you went to various places. We're going to talk about almost all of them. And you started and I find a weird place to start. You started in Iran. And now to most Americans, Iran is not quite Satan, but not exactly the kind of place you go looking for paradise. But let's maybe define what you're defining paradise as a place where it's peaceful and it's beautiful. Do you see anything coming up on your screen? I'm getting texts. Do you see that?
I'm not seeing text.
Good. I'm glad. It's coming up on my TV screen, or on my camera screen. You defined paradise as a place that's peaceful. And again, I don't think you generally mean it's really quiet, because you go to some not quiet places. Yes. But you started with Iran. Why?
For one reason, the very word paradise comes from Iran. And also, what's so interesting about Iran, as you said, many Americans might think of it as the great Satan, which shows how little most of us know about Iran. I had been researching and reading about Iran for 30 years, and within 4 hours of arrival, all my preconceptions were overturned. And one of the interesting things about Iran is it's almost a place where different notions of paradise collide, because of course the clerics and the government say that paradise belongs to the faithful Muslims, and in fact most of all belongs to martyrs who give their life to their religion. And most of the people behind closed doors think of a paradise more similar to the one you might see in Los Angeles, sex and drugs and rock and roll. So it's a very secular place, it's a very sacred place, and the two are always in collision.
Well, you write this, you say the Ayatollahs told followers that only those who give themselves to sacrifice and self-denial will reach paradise. But in fact, that's their take on it. And you notice that there are many visions of paradise even there. You said, I'd known before I arrived in Iran, with its many visions of heaven, that it would be sinuous and textured, a paradise of complication. But now, you wrote, I was having to make sense of heart-shaking, passionate displays of religious surrender from those who wish to have no part of religious rule. Shortly after your arrival, you went to a very, very holy place for Muslims. I guess the tomb of an Inman who was notorious in history, and it was the celebration of either his death or his birth. I don't know which. You can tell me that. And you were shocked at the passion and the number of people there.
Yes, well, let me say two things. As you said, the book is called The Half-Known Life, and it's almost about how little we know about the rest of the world in the age of information. And one of the things I can tell you, which I didn't guess before I went there, is that Iran is the richest, most glamorous, most sophisticated place I think I've ever been. And when I arrived, I was greeted at the airport by a man who spoke better English than I did because he'd been educated at a boarding school near London in the 1970s. He started telling me about John Cleese and Mr. Bean as we were driving towards our sumptuous hotel. I went into my hotel room and there was CNN playing just as if I was in New York City. I came back into the lobby and it was filled with young women, mostly in hijabs, traditional dress, but under the hijabs, wearing the latest fashions from Paris and clicking away on their smartphones. And suddenly I thought, this is not the place I've been hearing about or seeing on screen back in California. And as you said, that very first night, I decided to steal away from my guide. And so I went down to the lobby to the taxi desk and I asked them if they could find somebody to take me to what's actually the largest mosque in the world. It's a compound of 7 beautiful marble courtyards. And a young guy showed up with his car and he said, "Oh, well, I'll take you there." So we went there. And just as you were saying, when we arrived, there was this big full moon over these beautiful buildings. We couldn't move. Everywhere we looked, there were people seated on the ground, eating, sleeping, because they were spending 7 days and 7 nights in this sacred place. They were surrounded by huge video screens on which ayatollahs were delivering sermons. It was really extraordinary, as you said, expression of.
And you had no idea this was a holiday of any sort.
Exactly. I just arrived in the town of Mashhad, not knowing it was the most important week of the year, and millions of people had come from all across the Shia world to commemorate the death of this saint from 1200 years ago. And I suppose the most striking moment from that evening was that I went into the innermost sanctum where the saint is buried. And it was a small room. It was so crowded, I couldn't move. I got separated from my guide. And then I looked across the room to where he was standing, and there were tears in his eyes. And he had his hand on his heart in reverence for the long dead saint. And he was walking backwards so that he would never present his back to the Imam from the 8th century. So I thought, this is an amazing picture of Islamic piety. And then we went back out onto the street to walk back to his car. And he started telling me about his wife, who he said was an English woman back in Yorkshire awaiting their first child. And then he told me he had paid a human trafficker $2,300 to smuggle him into England in the back of a truck, to avoid, and wearing a mask so he wouldn't be detected. And then he told me that the British government had given him a lawyer and a translator, and they'd worked for 3 years round the clock to win him asylum status in England. So he was now a resident in England, but he was returning every summer to visit the mother and the mosque and the hometown he missed so much. And when he dropped me back at my hotel, as I say, this was my first full night in Iran. And I thought, all these years, 30 years I've been reading about Iran, I never heard about a dissident stealing back into the country that he's fled. And all these years I'd been reading up on Iran, I'd never heard of a very pious, devoted Islamic person who still didn't want to live in the heart of the Islamic Revolution. So all my simple ideas were exploded. And I thought, who knows what's going to happen next?
And I guess I think I'm reading you correctly, that this is mind-opening to me as well. It certainly isn't the perception that most Americans have of Iran, but I think also what you're saying is that there's this juxtaposition of this deep religiosity that you witness at the celebration of this Imam, yet, as we know, because of riots in the streets and women who don't want to, women who would like to be educated and so on, there's a good percentage of the population that don't hold a lot of respect for the Ayatollahs who rule the country.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of the problem. If we get the rest of the world on screen, we hear a lot about its nuclear policies or its government, but we hear so little about regular folks and daily life. And I think it's the same in reverse. When they hear about the US, they only hear about our president, whoever it is, and they don't hear about the rest of us, many of whom have ideas very different from our government. So, as you say, it was really eye-opening to go to this place. I went there on an American passport. The people couldn't have been more welcoming and excited to make contact with somebody from the US. Many of them spoke fluent English. And at every turn, it was really a country of surprises. And I
Well,
suppose that's why I travel. And you know this, Rudy, as a lifelong traveler. The reason to travel, especially when we can get so much of the world online, is the place you see never looks like the place you saw on screen. It's always more interesting and textured and contradictory.
did you find a bit of paradise? Did you take any the lessons beyond what you've told us so far away from your visit to Iran?
Well, I found very beautiful places and very diverse places. I'd never guessed that Iran in certain areas looks like Afghanistan and other areas looks like Europe. But really, I was confirmed in my sense that paradise is a way of seeing and it's a way of being. Paradise is in the eye of the beholder. And so I would look at a scene that was absolutely chaotic and wouldn't know what to do with it. But for somebody with a different way of thinking, that was paradise. And so it shook me up and it reminded me I have to go back to scratch to think about what paradise is. It's not a place on the map, and it is a place in
Mm.
consciousness. And how can I find a paradise I really believe in?
Well, I think you wrote a sentence I'm going to read back to you that really set up a theme for almost all the places you went. And that sentence was, um, the pursuit of happiness made deepest sense, I came to think, when seen in the framework of Eastern awareness that suffering is the first truth of existence. You don't think of suffering in connection with paradise. A true paradise, and I'm continuing your line, a true paradise has meaning only after one has outgrown all notions of perfection and taken a measure of the fallen world. And that is a theme that you come back to many times in the book, talking about, well, places that we wouldn't normally think is paradise, but the people who live there have found an inner peace and a spiritual home that is very different than Western sensibilities are. Fair enough?
Fair enough. And, just as those sentences suggested, if paradise is a place of perfection, none of us belong there because we're all imperfect. And if we show up at a perfect place, like Adam and Eve in the garden, it becomes imperfect. We have to leave. So that's part of what is going on. And yes, in terms of suffering, I most trust a paradise that exists in the midst of suffering and death, because that's the midst of real life. A paradise that some never land is one that none of us is going to be able to live in. And you and I have spoken about this before. I've been lucky enough, as you have, to go to Bali and Tahiti and these magical places. And when I land there, oh, I've arrived in absolute heaven. But of course, it's not heaven for the people around me. It's real life for them. And they're working very hard to make me and you comfortable. But they certainly wouldn't say this is heaven. Their idea of heaven is probably New York City or Los Angeles.
Yeah, you also talked about the brutal murders and drinking of neighbors' bloods during massacres in Bali, which I didn't even know about. Obviously, that's not going on now, but it did go on once upon a time. And one doesn't associate that with either paradise or Bali. But yeah, people do go to Bali and talk about it as being paradise. You then went to Kashmir. And you said Kashmir was the local paradise that bewitched your cousins in India
Yes.
for all of their lives. And of course, Kashmir is the northernmost part of India, and it's been contested as the land has been contested between Pakistan and India, and it's still an ongoing dispute that sometimes erupts into small wars. Some say the Garden of Eden was even there. So even Kashmir was not it. You said the beauty of Kashmir brought you to tears, and but more than anywhere you visited, hope and hostility, excuse me, hope and history were in hourly conflict because of this Muslim, Hindu, India, Pakistan tension that is omnipresent apparently.
Yeah, and I think Kashmir is a good example of what I was just saying, because really, if you're a visitor there and you're staying on a houseboat on the lake with people paddling up in little boats to offer you spices and colored boxes, and you're eating beautiful food on a sun deck and everything is absolutely silent, you are in paradise. But 10 minutes across the water are just the encampments and the conflict that you were talking about. So it's very much heaven even now for the visitor, and very much probably hell, and certainly real life for the resident. But it was fascinating to go there because I'd grown up with my mother's stories of Kashmir. As you said in your introduction, my mother was born and grew up in India. And for her, it was this magical place of snow-capped mountains and
Hmm.
meadows and the things that you don't see in urban India. And it still is that. And when I mentioned about hope and history, I think a lot of this book came out of a poem that I allude to at the beginning, as you know, by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. And when he saw Nelson Mandela released from prison after 27 years, he delivered this wonderful line: "Once in a lifetime, hope and history can rhyme." And I think by that I understand the sense that history tells all of us we have sorrows and wounds we can never erase. But a life without hope is no life at all. We've got to maintain hope in the middle of reality. And so this book I was very much writing in the thick of the pandemic, under lockdown, when everyone was in such a state of anxiety and unsettledness. And yet I thought, if there is a paradise, it has to be one we can be found even now. Life's always going to be difficult, but that difficulty doesn't preclude hope and light and inspiration. So it was a way of searching, not for, as I say, for a never, never land in the heavens, but for a qualified beauty right here in the middle of the real life.
And in Kashmir, you were closer to the heavens than any of the rest of us because you had the Himalayas there. You were almost touching the sky, and
Yes.
the conventional idea of heaven in Western religion. You write, paradise could seem the cruelest notion of all if it meant pretending that the real world didn't exist. And I think you found that in several places you visited. Then I love your line. You went to Australia and you left the city and you went out into the, everybody knows the vast open spaces of Australia in the center of the country. And you wrote, and again, if you don't pardon me, if you pardon me reading it back, you're such a great writer that, I mean, normally I don't read much authors' things back to them, but you're such a good writer that it's worth our viewers hearing. And I
Thank you.
quote you here: "The red rocks and canyons might remind me of Arizona or Utah, but they breathed with an intensity, a sense of the ancient that I'd found in no natural landscape before. I couldn't say it was paradise, but more of a different kind of reality. And what it gave in its fascination was that the traditional owners had never lost contact with their gods. Faithfully, they kept linking heaven and earth with their songs, while the rest of us remained stranded in perplexity, able to feel the power of the rocks, but not to read any of the runes. Inner Australia lived in a language few of us could speak." And you said the Aboriginal people might call themselves Christians, but they don't understand why Europe. Again, I'm quoting you. They don't understand why Europeans need to go to a special house to talk to God with their eyes closed. For them, the promised land was nowhere but the land around them. Sounded like you were coming pretty close to paradise there.
The only I was, but the only problem was it was their paradise,
True.
and I was an intruder there. And so I realized that that land is the holy text for the indigenous people in Australia, and the Aboriginal population know that land the way people in our country might know the Bible, but I couldn't read it. So it was an interesting vicarious taste of paradise. And it reminded me what we find in places like Jerusalem, which, as you know, is another place I consider in the book,
Yes.
which is the trouble with paradise is that your idea of paradise probably isn't mine. So it was wonderful to see this land that was sacred to the local population, but it didn't necessarily bring me closer to paradise. It just, as you said, reminded me that paradise could be found if you know how to read the world around you.
Right. And if you had gone and built a split level home there and set up a house, it would have flown in the face of what the people who live there consider paradise, obviously.
Yeah.
I Jerusalem. Okay, that was Jerusalem. I presume you'd been to Jerusalem before this research trip,
I've been there a few times, yes.
right? You call it, and again, you say it better than I can. I've been there a few times, but I couldn't have written it like this. Quote, this is Pico Iyer, I'm interviewing Pico Iyer, the author. His book, I should remind you, is called The Half-Known Life, In Search of Paradise. It's a book in which he traveled to many places in the world. We've covered a couple of them. We're going to cover a couple more. Looking for paradise, not in the conventional sense of a travel book or even a National Geographic piece, but in a different sense. You said Jerusalem was, and I quote you, a riot of views of paradise overlapping at crooked angles till one was left with the sorrow of six different Christian orders sharing the same space and lashing out at each other with brooms. you arrived saying that you didn't think you'd really feel any, you wouldn't be touched by Jerusalem because you're neither a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. But right after getting there, you caught the passion of those three religions that are so often in conflict, and you almost, keeping in mind that your book came out in early 1990, early 2023, you almost predicted what is reality right now in the Middle East, sadly, um, which is the culmination of way too much passion.
Way too much paradise or way too much heaven, but conflicting visions of heaven. And as you know, sadly, that's been going on for thousands of years there. But you, just as you said, Rudy, I mean, although I didn't belong or don't belong to any of those three religions, tears would come to my eyes in Jerusalem. I would go every morning in the pre-dawn dark through those narrow, uneven passageways to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I would sit in a little cavern almost with just an irregular ledge and a flickering candle, and something there would go right through me. I mean, maybe it's just 1700 years of prayer and passion and devotion that have taken place in that site, but it shook me like nowhere else. And sometimes I'll be walking down the street here in Japan and I'll feel myself summoned and I'm magnetically pulled towards Jerusalem, which is just a reminder of how much force it carries. But as you said in what you read, I knew before I went there that within a few hundred yards there would be the sacred sites of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, each with its own very distinct vision of heaven. But I never guessed that when I stepped into one of the holiest places in Christendom, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there'd be 6 different orders. And if the Franciscans step 1 inch into the Greek Orthodox section, they'll start going after one another with brooms. So it's both a refutation of heaven and it's a very moving proof that something divine exists. That's a kind of contradiction of human life, I suppose, that we all have this intuition that there's something beyond us. But when we put a name or a text to that intuition, my name and text is never going to be yours.
You call Jerusalem a parable that was really a cautionary tale.
Yes, exactly. Well said. Yes.
And unfortunately, you said it, and unfortunately, we're seeing it. You said everything was at stake here. Almost everything constituted a trespass. You took your shoes off.
Yes.
No, actually, that's sorry. You were in India for that one. Never mind. Excuse that. But you said a pilgrim, quoting you again, a pilgrim very often is traveling in search of the past. But Jerusalem was the center of 1,000 clashing pasts, and all of them made up the nightmare from which it's longing to awaken. When you traced yourself back to your Austrian hospice one evening, you couldn't rest for all the voices crowding inside you. You evoke this picture of a cacophony of different religions and different views, each one convinced they're right, each one convinced they knew where paradise was and that they had found it, and the rest of you, don't step into my part of that Church of Holy Sepulchre. I mean, it's really it's always a tense place. Now it's beyond tense, obviously. Now as Israel and Hamas go at it neck to neck, but I thought you captured Jerusalem very, very well. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it really puts you, as you said, into a kind of fever state. And I would say it's the center of human conflict, but it's also the center of heavenly longing. So the heavens are there in the midst of all the conflict.
Well, there's a word that describes a syndrome. I don't know, it's a Jerusalem
Yes.
syndrome, it may be called, that some people get there and they feel they're somehow, I don't know what, they've been turned into godlike whatever people and they can't get back to their normal lives. I think it's called the Jerusalem syndrome, isn't it?
It is. And I think part of the power of Jerusalem is nobody comes there casually. It's not a place you're going to en route to somewhere else. And the kind of visitor you meet is a very unusual one. It's not in the book, but I remember one day I was staying in a hospice in the old city and I was having breakfast with and next to me was an older American man and his younger friend from Germany. And I said, "Oh, where have you come from?" And they said, "Oh, a little town called Paso Robles." I said, "Wow, that's amazing. That's just near where I was coming from in Santa Barbara. How did you get here?" And I meant, "Did you take United or Lufthansa?" They said, "Oh, we walked." And I said, no, I mean, how did you get from California to Jerusalem? we walked. They spent a whole year walking across the US, just relying on the kindness of strangers every night for food and shelter, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and then walked across Europe for another month. The woman had broken her leg at one point in Italy, was in hospital. She was on crutches when I saw her. But every morning, as I, in the pre-dawn dark, was walking to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there she was too, on their crutches. And so just to meet people who had walked 2 years in order to get to this place means that the fellow travelers are themselves one of the remarkable sights of Jerusalem, whether or not they're suffering from Jerusalem syndrome or not.
I'll leave Jerusalem with one of your sentences. In a city made up of only a city made up only of inner lives, the question at the heart of everyone was as simple as it was unanswerable: how to make peace and passion rhyme. And if that isn't a moniker for the current situation between Israel and both the West Bank and Gaza, I don't know what is. Okay, so now you're going back to your, I guess, cultural touchstones to the Himalayas. We talked a little about that. Let me stop here. You wrote, and I remarked upon the fact you got to Jerusalem and you didn't really think you had any dogs in this fight because you weren't Jewish. You weren't a Muslim. You weren't Christian. Are you a Buddhist? You're a Buddhist.
I'm not. I mean, in
You're
some
not.
ways, I'm a global mongrel, for better and worse, because I grew up in England. I went through all Anglican schools. My parents are Hindu, but they're also theosophists and professors of comparative religion. And I've lived in Buddhist Japan for 36 years with a Buddhist wife, but I don't have a Buddhist practice. So I'm open to everything, and ready to be instructed by everywhere, but I don't have one fixed commitment.
But you're
Which
very close to the Dalai Lama. He has toured
yes,
Japan, I think, 10 times, and you were with him
yes,
almost every day.
yes.
And but again, then again, you find refuge. I think it's around Santa Barbara in a is it a Franciscan retreat?
Benedictine,
That's
exactly. Yes.
Benedictine retreat, right? And so yeah, you're really a piece of everything, aren't you? You're trying to take the best of each thing, each religion or each passion.
Yes, and so in that way, I'm sort of typical of this global moment when all of us are lucky enough to have people around us from every tradition. But it's also really important to make one strong commitment, and I haven't been so good on that. But as you're right, I mean, I've been lucky enough to be traveling and talking with the Dalai Lama for 50 years now, and I've been lucky enough to have grown up with the Christian tradition that has brought me to those Catholic monks. And I feel that Buddhism is a very good tradition for learning about suffering and reality and old age and sickness. And Christianity is a wonderful tradition for transmitting light and the notion of resurrection and springtime. So I learn a lot about the autumn from Japan, and I learn a lot about the springtime from my Catholic monk friends.
And you learn a lot about Buddhism from your wife. Just take a little tea tour here, and I find it fascinating what she does to honor uh, her deceased relatives. What does she do? Is it once a week?
Every day.
Every
It
day?
happened 2 hours ago as we're
Can
talking.
you share that? Can you share that with us?
Yes, I mean, she wakes up every morning, she makes some really nice tea, she gathers her parents' favorite snack, and she puts it out on the household altar for her mother, who died 5 years ago, and for her father, who died 10 years ago. But as far as she's concerned, they're very alive. She talks to them. When she has a day off from her work, she travels 2 hours by 3 trains and a bus to their graves and fills them in on the family news. And every August in Japan, it's believed that the departed, those who've died, come and visit their loved ones for 3 days to learn about what's been happening and to take it back to the heavens. And it's a wonderful way of thinking of death, not as a termination, but just as if they've moved to another room. And you have to talk differently to reach them in the other room, and you can't always see them, but they're still alive in you. And I think any of us who's been through a death knows that if you lose somebody you care about, she's often more alive in you after she's gone than when you took her for granted or when she was in the room. But you're right. I towards the end of this book, I come back to Japan where I live because they have such a liberating view when it comes to death and seeing it as a beginning as well as a change.
And a footnote: she also didn't one of her parents really like to read, and she will go to the grave and read books to her
Yeah, or even
departed relatives.
well, even better than that. My wife's always loved reading novels, and she's never enjoyed reading history. And suddenly, 4 or 5 years ago, after her mother died, she started reading history novels. I said, what's with this? You never read them before. She said, oh, I'm reading them for my mother. My mother's off in some other world now. She can't read the history books she loves. So I'm
Oh,
channeling her, as it were. I'm reading
oh,
her on her behalf. And actually, it sounded very strange at first, but I think many of us have some models. If my mother really enjoyed watching Jeopardy when she was alive, and now I watch it religiously when I'm back in the US, and it's probably part of me is watching it to keep her alive, and so that, as if she were watching it through me.
does your wife ever go and tell the relative when she's talking to the relatives about her vagabond husband who's never around because he's always going from country to country?
Yes, well, now she can talk about her vagabond life because she's retired, and so everywhere I go, she comes with me. But
Oh, lovely. Did she go with you on this book partly?
some of these places,
Oh,
yes,
good.
yes, the Himalayas, for example, very much.
All right, the You're going to you call it Himalayas, because you're English or partly English
Oh,
anyway.
Indian, yeah.
And I call it we call it the Himalayas in
Yes.
America. You say the Himalayas or the people of the Himalayas seem to belong to an earlier time, maybe in part because the citizens have never lost a sense of living within a field of spirits far beyond our reckoning. The human is a tiny thing in an encompassing campus. That's a a different way of looking at the world. Where in America, it's all about me and my self improvement and whether I'm working out and how my diet's doing, and I'm not really impressed by my surroundings, no matter how magnificent they are, whether they're the Rockies or the Pacific Ocean.
Yes, but of course, it wasn't always like that in America because the indigenous population felt that there were gods everywhere, and the pilgrims who
Yes,
first arrived in America were very, very devout people. So when I go to a place like Tibet, I think this is similar to how it was in the West, maybe 200-300 years ago. I've been spending a lot of time reading Shakespeare now, and of course, that's full of gods organizing our activities and spirits and ghosts and the like. And I think if we don't believe in those, we're not catching all of reality. As you say, when I'm in California, it's easy for me to believe I'm the center of the world and I'm
right.
making my own destiny. And then suddenly one day I was in my family home and I went upstairs and I was surrounded by 70-foot flames and our house was burnt down and I lost everything in the world. And it was a reminder that we're not the center of the world. And there are all these bigger forces, hurricanes, floods, wildfires that are putting us in place. And whether or not you believe in gods, you have to be reminded that humans are actually a very tiny part of this much larger scheme. And I think when we hear about the climate crisis, that's another reminder to us that we're not the
That,
center of the world.
well, I'm wondering as you say this, are we making progress? I mean, we talk about the original the Indians of North America and their connection to the land of the Australians who live in the outback and find their church right there, or right in front of them, everywhere they live. Are we making any progress? Or are we going backwards?
Such a good question. I think the people in Tibet and the outback in Australia would be very jealous of certain of the technological things that we have in the US. And we're certainly going forwards when it comes to technology and
Yes,
healthcare
we
and
are.
longer life. But I don't think that humanity is progressing, even though technology is. And I don't think we are wiser than our grandparents or wiser than people were in Shakespeare's days. So technology encourages us to believe, oh, we're so much better off than we were 100 years ago. And in certain ways we are, but in certain ways, maybe not.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm sure in your travels with the Dalai Lama, you've learned a lot, whether you're a Buddhist or not.
Yes, yes,
Um,
so
and you
much.
you say that he reminds folks who come to hear him speak that paradise can only be found in the middle of what's around us. You can't get on a
Yes,
plane and go to Tahiti and whoop, you're in paradis. He says Shangri-La exists only in the imagination. Real life can offer us pleasure that fantasy leaves out. And you touched on the acceptance of death, for example, on the part of your wife, who obviously is a Buddhist. And you write that none of us, or Buddhists teach this, and the Dalai Lama does it, none of us uh, nothing can save us from sickness or old age or death. It's all going to happen to every one of us. All we can try to do is bring an undiluted eye to our condition to see how we can ease some suffering. That's our job.
yes, and nothing can save us from ourselves except ourselves. In other words, if you're a very angry person and you go to Tahiti, you're probably not going to become less angry. You'll start complaining about the people around you or the food or whatever. So, travel itself isn't going to bring us closer to paradise. It has to be some inner transformation. And just as you say, I think one thing that people don't always understand about the Dalai Lama, if I were to describe him, I'd say the word I would use is realist. More than anybody I know, he's a realist. He's not
And he's
interested.
funny.
Sorry?
He's
He's
got a
funny.
great
He's
sense
very,
of
very
humor.
funny.
Yeah,
He's very,
he's
very
not
funny.
some, ponderous.
No, that's right. No, he's very, very funny. He's instantly engaging and accessible. He's just like you and me, and he always reminds us of that. But he's also been leader of his people since the age of 4, so 84 years now. So he doesn't want to talk about heaven or nirvana or any of that. How are we going to make our lives right better right now with our friends and with our neighbors? And as you know, there's a scene in the book where he lets me sit in on all his private audiences with other leaders and scientists and heads of
Oh,
state. And one
oh.
time, a Korean man came into him, to see him, and the Korean gentleman was very, very excited. And at one point, he said, "Your Holiness, you're going to go to the Pure Land. You're going to go to paradise." And the Dalai Lama said, "I don't want to go to paradise. I want to be right here where I can help other people and where I can learn from other people. My job is to be a human being, not to be up, above the clouds somewhere." And that was a good lesson too. That he felt that the best thing he could do is serve and try to offer compassion to others, not be removed from us.
And be happy where he is, which reminds me of a therapist once telling a friend of mine who was very unhappy where she was living in life. And I'm going to go move to Albuquerque or something. I don't know. And the therapist said, wherever you go, there you are.
Yes, yes.
You take it with you. Albuquerque isn't going to make it all go away.
No,
Whatever.
exactly. I think that's perfect, probably Buddhist wisdom. And I sometimes think of all the people I've been lucky enough to meet. The Dalai Lama has probably suffered more than anybody. He's been taken away from his country for 64 years now. He's seen almost 12 of his siblings die. He's opposed by the government of the largest nation on earth. He's had to put
China.
up with so much. And just as you were saying, what is he famous for? Really infectious laugh, constant smile, and robust confidence. So it's a very good example of somebody who's lived a really hard life and is extremely happy where he is and isn't distracted by his sufferings.
And if he had written your book, it would have been 3 pages long. Paradise? It's where you are. It's
He's
where you
writing his
are.
book just with this person, with his example as he moves through the world.
And I've never been to Sri Lanka. You went to Sri Lanka, and of course, that's a country that's been battered by tsunamis, by internal conflict. And you reminded me of a guy I hadn't thought about in a long time, Thomas Merton, who was an American, an English monk who spent almost half his time in a cloister in Kentucky, of all places, and then flew to Asia, and he went to Sri Lanka, and he once wrote that was it the Dalai Lama who wrote it, or did Thomas Merton write this? He once wrote that to have all the answers might be proof that you weren't asking the right questions. Was that Merton?
It was Merton,
Yeah, I think so.
yes, and one reason I wanted to have him in this book, as with the Dalai Lama, is I'm sure, like you, Rudy, I've never seen our country and our world so divided right now. And so Thomas Merton, a faithful Catholic monk for 27 years, going to Buddhist Asia, seeking out the Dalai Lama, being really moved by the Buddhas he saw in Sri Lanka. And then the Dalai Lama is really one of the most visible Buddhists in the world, seeking out Thomas Merton and learning about Christianity from him. So just the notion that each of them were looking outside, beyond the wall, and outside their own beliefs to learn from others was very inspiring. And it is amazing that this Catholic monk, probably the most famous Catholic monk of the 20th century, had this great moment of realization looking at 2 Buddhas in Sri Lanka and then died 4 days later. And the other interesting thing about Sri Lanka, and even though I was visiting it during its time of war, it really is in so many ways a tropical paradise. But precisely because it's a tropical paradise, the Dutch came in there, the Portuguese came in there, the British came in there, and now different groups within Sri Lanka are fighting over it. So the fact that it's a paradise has made it the source of constant conflict, because everybody wants a piece of paradise.
You had a great line. You said, um, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British took away ginger and indigo and 7 kinds of cinnamon. I had no idea there were 7 kinds of cinnamon. And I quote you here: "The island of gems was a rusty box with so many hands grabbing at the precious stones within that almost everyone was left with dripping blood." Pico, you should write more.
Well, I'm so touched you read this so carefully, Rudy. Thank you for
Oh, I read it
actually
very
singling
carefully.
out these
I
sentences.
read
Yeah.
it on a long flight from the United States to Thailand, so I had like 21 hours at least to read it, and I highlighted a lot of stuff. And sometimes I teared up reading it. Your writing is so gorgeous. I would recommend Pico Iyer's book, which is called "The Half Known Life in Search of Paradise," to anybody. It's a moving, meaningful book. Um, You also write, it's so easy to place paradise in the past or the future, anywhere but here.
Mm.
And that's one of the themes that we've been talking about since you joined me, and it certainly goes throughout the book. And that's where your subtitle, or your title of your book, "Our Lives Can Only Be Half Known in as far as their final act." And the title of the book is "The Half Known Life," and that's apparently what we're all living. And I think it's true. Um, you then went to a Buddhist retreat in Japan, called Koyasan. Now, is that I'm not familiar with Koyasan. I didn't look it up. Is it a religion or is it a place, or
It's a
both?
place, it's a mountain about an hour and a half out of Osaka. So you go on this train through smaller and smaller stations. When you get to the end of the line, you get in a cable car, you go to the top of a mountain, and at the
Hmm.
top, nothing except 117 Buddhist temples, 200,000 graves.
117.
Yes, nothing but temples at the top. And anyone who goes there, whether you're whatever your religion, whatever your gender, you stay in one of the temples. You eat the monks' very tasty vegetarian food. You can go and see the fire ceremonies in the morning, and then there's this graveyard with 250,000 graves of many of the most famous people in Japanese history. So it's
Oh
a
my
very
goodness.
powerful place.
I'm sorry. I've been to Japan so I've never heard of it. Let me take away one of your, again, quoting you, one of your lessons from there. This might not be consoling, you wrote, but it was part of the monk's practice to savor what he saw and live calmly with what he could not know. Again, there's that theme of not knowing everything but being content with your reality. You write, and we're coming to a close of this, and I'll let you have dinner because it's later for you, and or it's earlier for you, excuse me. In Japan, paradise, in short, is regained by finding the wonder within the moment. All the light or beauty we could find, we had to find now. The fact that nothing lasts is the reason that everything matters. That's why I teared up reading your book. I'm getting moist-eyed now. You did a great job writing, a beautiful job writing. And
Thank
just
you. I mean, that's that you just what you just singled out pretty much the most important sentence in the whole book. And as I said, it came out of the pandemic. My mother was 89. She was about to leave this world. And as I was watching this, as all of us get older, I was thinking the fact that I can't hold on to my mother forever is exactly the reason. Make the most of right now. Don't distract myself by thinking of the past or thinking of what I'll do 10 years from now. Right now, it's a beautiful day. It's blue sky. Make the most of this because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
before we end, we should just touch the last place you went, which is a town in India, Varanasi, which is an 11th century town that you said, I didn't know this, was supposed to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth. I didn't know that, but it's a pilgrimage place. I visited, not really understanding much of it, many when I was much younger. Um, and you met a Franciscan priest who said, and I don't know if he said this or you said this, but I wrote it. The goal in life is not to become spiritual, but to become human. Each of us has the capacity through the discerning use of our minds to see past some of our ignorance and come to terms as life as it is. Beautiful way to end this conversation, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I would just say that Varanasi is sort of the Hindu Jerusalem, and
Yes.
even
Yes.
even even though I'm born into Hinduism and I'm 100% Indian, as I was saying before, I was completely freaked out by the chaos and confusion of this
It's a
place.
chaotic town. There's a lot of people dying there and bathing in pretty dirty waters, but happy.
Yes, and as I was standing looking at these dead bodies floating past, an American Buddhist monk suddenly showed up and he looked across the scene of chaos and confusion. He said, "Isn't this glorious? This is human life. This is birth and death and everything in between. This is paradise." And it really shook me up. And I realized this is the place we have to make paradise. Wherever we are sitting right now, as you said, wherever you are, that's where you
There
are.
you are. There you
Yep,
are.
and make
Pico
the best.
Iyer, Pico, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you very, very much. I can't recommend this book highly enough. Again, if you just tuned in, the book is called The Half Known Life in Search of Paradise, written by Pico Iyer. Get it, read it. You'll feel better for reading it. Pico, thank
Thank
you
you
so
so much,
much.
Rudy. Thank you very much.
All right, take care. Bye bye.